It was a quiet morning in Hayward, California, the kind of ordinary morning that should have disappeared unnoticed into the folds of time. But on November 20th, 2018, time refused to keep its silence. That morning, a 74-year-old man named John Arthur Getreu answered the door to what he believed was a small, awkward mistake. A woman claiming she'd backed into his car. He chuckled politely, adjusted his footing, and stepped outside. But within seconds, his world changed. Face the car, came the command. Behind him, the illusion shattered. The woman wasn't a neighbor. She was part of a carefully planned operation. The moment Getreu turned around, officers moved in. A quiet, coordinated takedown of a man no one in the neighborhood suspected of being a murderer, let alone a serial one. A dog barked. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower buzzed. But in front of the beige stucco house, a man who had evaded justice for more than 4 decades was now in handcuffs. He didn't resist. As deputies guided him to a patrol car, Getreu offered him a nod of respect. "Good line for coming out of the house," he muttered. "Got me out of the house." He thought it clever, polite, a strange sort of admiration for the trap he just walked into. But behind the calm exterior, behind the grandfatherly smile and Boy Scout leader past, was a man linked by DNA to 2 of the most haunting cold cases in California history. And this arrest was only the beginning. Months earlier, detectives in Santa Clara County reopened a 45-year-old murder case, the brutal slaying of Leslie Marie Perlov, a Stanford graduate and young law clerk, whose strangled body was discovered at the Stanford Dish hiking area in 1973. Leslie had vanished after work. Her 1972 orange Chevy Nova was later found abandoned near Page Mill Road. Her body was discovered the next day under a tree. A floral scarf was knotted around her neck, used as a ligature. There were no witnesses, no suspects. For decades, her case gathered dust in a forgotten cabinet. That is, until forensic genealogy and new DNA technology breathed life into the investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. DNA extracted from beneath Leslie's fingernails. When run through a public genealogical database, it pinged, not on John Getreu directly, but on his family tree. From there, it was only a matter of time. To the world, John was unremarkable. A father, a husband, a security guard at a tech company near Stanford. For years, he led a quiet life in the Bay Area. He was even a Boy Scout leader, a man trusted by families, children, the community. But the detectives digging into his past soon unearthed something no one saw coming. Long before California, before the Scout meetings, before the marriage and the mortgage, there had been Germany. 1963. West Germany, to be precise. Back then, John was just 18 and living on a U.S. military base where his father was stationed. It was there he was accused his DNA matched to another victim. And this wasn't Germany. This was home. The victim was Leslie Perlov. And she wasn't the only one. Just 1 year after Leslie's death, in 1974, another body had been found. Janet and Taylor, 21, was the daughter of the Stanford football coach. She had last been seen hitchhiking in Palo Alto. Her body was discovered along Sand Hill Road, also in the Stanford Dish area. Just like Leslie, Janet had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The cases were eerily similar, but for over 40 years, no connection had been made. The trail had gone cold, until the DNA on Leslie's fingernails pointed directly to John. And when investigators secretly collected DNA from a discarded coffee cup John used, testing it against DNA found on Janet Taylor's torn underwear, the match was irrefutable. 2 women, 2 lives taken. And John Getreu was the link. Back in the interrogation room, the sergeant played the long game. He didn't confront John with the DNA just yet. Instead, he probed, nudged, asked abstract questions about the hills, the Stanford area, whether John remembered stopping by certain roads. At first, Getreu denied everything. But then he slipped. That girl, or the other one up on the hill. He wasn't supposed to know about 2 girls. The detectives had only shown him 1 photograph, only mentioned 1 victim by name. Yet John spoke of the other one. Even now, he didn't realize he was confessing with every breath. This was no fluke, no case of mistaken identity. 2 separate crime scenes, 2 separate victims, DNA in both, and a man who had once walked away from a child's murder in Germany, now caught again, by science, by time, by his own words. But the full story, the truth, that would take more unraveling. Because this wasn't just a double homicide. This was the work of a serial killer. And the ghosts of Stanford were about to speak again. That's the first girl, or the one up on the hill. He said it so casually, as if he were identifying groceries, not murder victims. As if it were normal to speak about one strangled woman, and then reference the other before anyone ever said there was another. In that sterile, windowless room, John Arthur Getreu was unraveling, not by screaming, not by crying, but through a slow, quiet collapse. A man so used to hiding in plain sight that he forgot how to hide it all. What detectives now faced was a living puzzle. A man whose crimes spanned continents and decades. A man who had walked out of juvenile prison in Germany with a clean slate, only to rebuild a life of predation behind a mask of trust. And the mask? It looked like a husband, a father, a hospital worker, a Boy Scout leader. Detectives already knew he worked near the Stanford campus in the early 1970s. In fact, John had been employed as a security guard just miles from where both Leslie Perlov and Janet Taylor were killed. By day, he patrolled hallways. By night, he hunted. When they asked if he'd ever been near Page Mill Road, where Leslie's car was a warrant. Then compared to the samples collected decades ago from Leslie's fingernails and Janet's underwear, the result? Match. Match. The odds of two separate matches being coincidence? Statistically impossible. John Arthur Getreu's life, meticulously stitched together with lies and half-truths, no registry, no warnings, no trail. It was the second time he'd slipped through the cracks. The first was Germany. The second was Palo Alto. And now, decades later, he was facing a reckoning that never came. Until now. What makes someone like Getreu so dangerous isn't just what he did. It's how long he got away with it. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't impulsive. He was calculated, patient, and most chilling of all, ordinary. He learned early on that appearances are protection, that the world forgives a white man with a calm voice and a tucked-in shirt, that smiles can mask sociopathy, that silence buys freedom. Even in the interrogation room, his voice remained steady, almost bored. I'm not guilty. I didn't kill anyone. But if you think I did, fine. He seemed more annoyed than remorseful, until he heard the word DNA. Then, for the first time, his eyes darted. They showed him Leslie's photo again. Do you recognize her? He stared, then deflected, then said something that chilled the air in the room. That's not the girl I killed. The detective froze. So you did kill a girl? Getreu blinked, realizing the trap he had stepped into. No, I meant that's not the girl you showed me earlier. But the damage was done. The man who had remained hidden in the community for 40 years, biking to work, petting his dog, serving church brunches, had finally let the mask slip. He wasn't a father. He was a predator with a body count. And yet, this wasn't the climax. Not yet, because there were still questions unanswered, still files unopened, still other girls from the Stanford killing fields whose cases remain unsolved. And the fear that echoed down those California trails was growing louder. Was John Arthur Getreu the only one? Or just the one they finally caught? We're not trying to find out who did this. We already know. We just want to understand why. By the time John Arthur Getreu sat in a California courtroom in 2021, he had already revealed more than he intended, and less than the families deserved. He'd mumbled about DNA. He'd hinted at a second girl. He'd tripped over truths he'd kept buried for 40 years. But now, he was surrounded by walls that wouldn't bend. He wasn't in the woods. He wasn't behind a scout meeting. He was in court, staring into the faces of the people whose lives he'd broken. And behind them, two names loomed like tombstones etched into silence. Janet and Taylor and Leslie Marie Perlov. She'd been just 21, the daughter of Stanford's legendary football coach, Chuck Taylor. Yes, the very man behind the iconic Converse shoe, a beloved figure, a family of stature. But even fame couldn't stop a predator. In March of 1974, Janet was hitchhiking home. It was a common practice in the Bay Area at the time, especially for students. She never arrived. Her body was found face down in a ditch off Sand Hill Road. Her jeans torn, her underwear cut, her body strangled. At the time, it was ruled as yet another unsolved tragedy in the long list of campus area murders. And as years passed, her story became a file, her photo a memory. Until now, her voice echoed through courtroom walls. Not through sound, but through DNA evidence, preserved in her torn clothing for nearly half a century. And it matched John Arthur Getreu. The monster who had once stood over her lifeless body now sat defenseless in front of her family. By the time the trial began in September 2021, Getreu looked frail, old, sick, tethered to an oxygen tank. But behind the oxygen tube and slumped shoulders was a man who had once overpowered 3 young women, strangled them with scarves, hands, rope, anything he could find. In court, he played the part. The helpless man, barely able to speak, face sagging with age. But the prosecution refused to let his frailty erase the horror of his past. They laid it all out. The DNA from Janet's underwear, his history of assault, his confession to the 1963 Germany murder, his Boy Scout credentials used as a mask to lure trust. The defense tried to paint out old memories, no confession, just evidence. But DNA doesn't age. It doesn't forget. It doesn't lie. When the families took the stand, something shifted. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They spoke with quiet rage, the kind that only decades of grief can harden. A sister, a friend, a brother, each telling the story Janet couldn't tell. One read from her diary. Another held up her college photograph. The jury sat still, their eyes wide, not just from emotion, but from the stark contrast. How could a man who looked like a retiree commit such monstrous acts? But that's the danger. That's the lesson. Serial killers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door who walks his dog and mows his lawn. If Janet's murder was shocking because of her public family, Leslie's case was haunting for a different reason. It had been nearly forgotten. In 1973, Leslie had worked at a law library near Stanford. Smart, soft-spoken, driven. She was last seen heading to her car after work. The next day, her body was found beneath an oak tree at the edge of a hiking trail, a floral scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her orange Chevy Nova had been discovered abandoned near Page Mill Road. There was no suspect, no motive, nothing. And so, her case slipped into the silence of cold storage until DNA from beneath her fingernails, recovered and tested in 2019, pulled her back into the light. It was a genetic time capsule, and the name it gave was the same, John Arthur Getreu. What sealed Getreu's fate wasn't just the DNA in one murder. It was the double blow. A sample from Janet Taylor's torn underwear. Another from under Leslie Perlov's fingernails. Both matches. Both precise. Investigators had also cross-referenced Getreu's DNA with other cold cases in the area, like the murder of Arliss Perry, a Stanford woman found dead in a church with an ice pick in her skull, and David Levine, a grad student stabbed in 1973. No confirmed links were made there, but the pattern was unsettling. A cluster of brutal murders, all in the Stanford orbit, all around the time John Arthur Getreu lived and worked nearby. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the truth is buried deeper than we'll ever know. It took the jury less than an hour. They returned with a unanimous decision. Guilty of first-degree murder, with the added charge, infliction of great bodily injury. The sentence? 7 years to life. Not much, but for a man in his late 70s on oxygen, it was effectively a death sentence. The judge stared him down. The families exhaled. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, justice, long delayed, finally arrived. But the story wasn't over. Because in January 2023, Getreu pleaded guilty to Leslie's murder too, a second conviction, a second life sentence, to be served consecutively. The two women he'd once left in the quiet hills were now bound together, not just in death, but in justice. On September 22nd, 2023, John Arthur Getreu died of natural causes in a California prison. No dramatic ending, no final confession, just a international scandal. Witnesses came forward. A few kids said they saw her walking with a young man after the dance. Someone tall, thin, maybe wearing military base clothes. Eventually, the name surfaced. John Arthur Getreu. He was arrested, charged with rape and murder, and stood trial in a German juvenile court. Because he was 18, he was tried as a juvenile, a loophole that would echo tragically decades later. The verdict? Guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in a German juvenile prison. But that's not the shocking part. He only served 6. And then, quietly, in 1969, he was put on a plane at Ramstein Air Base and flown home. No U.S. criminal record. No warning system. No public alert. It was as if Margaret Williams had never existed. John was dropped off at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. His father picked him up, and that was it. No parole, no tracking, no reporting to American authorities. He moved to California, settled down, got married, got a job, and started over, but he hadn't changed. The predator inside him had just learned a new skill: how to hide. In the early 1970s, Getreu embedded himself in the Palo Alto community. He worked as a security guard at a Stanford-adjacent facility. He volunteered as a Boy Scout leader. He was a father and husband, taking family trips and hosting barbecues. Later, he became a medical records technician at a cardiology clinic. His life was the image of suburban calm. But underneath the khakis and key cards, he was still the 18-year-old standing over a dead girl in the snow. He had simply learned how to smile. You might ask, how? How could a man with a murder conviction in Germany walk into California and gain access to children, pass background checks, even find work on or near university campus? The answer: there was no system, no international criminal database, no U.S.-Germany information sharing for juvenile crimes, no global sex offender registry. And Getreu knew it. He lived during a time when being white, well-spoken, and mild-mannered gave you a cloak of credibility. He blended in perfectly. Have you ever been arrested? No. He said it with confidence because, in the United States, it was true. Then came 1975, the moment that should have ended him. A 17-year-old girl told police she had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and threatened by John while he was her Explorer Scout leader. She lived. She fought. She reported it. But the result? No prison time. No sex offender registry. Just 30 days in jail on weekends. A plea deal, quietly filed and quickly forgotten. Even that didn't raise alarms. Even that didn't make the papers. The courts had no idea they were letting a convicted murderer from Germany off the hook. And John? He simply moved on, like nothing had happened. Between 1975 and 2018, there are no public records of criminal behavior linked to Getreu. Did he go dormant? Or did he just get better at hiding? The Stanford area during the 1970s and early 1980s was plagued by unsolved killings. Arliss Perry, David Levine, Lisa Beery, and others. Young women, strangled, beaten, stabbed. Some cases bore similar MOS: remote dump sites, ligatures, sexually motivated violence. None have been definitively tied to Getreu. But now that he's gone and his DNA sits in the California Cody system, there's a chance, however small, that more victims may emerge. His death may have closed the courtroom, but it opened the door to questions we may never fully answer. What united all of Getreu's known crimes wasn't just violence. It was power. In 1963, he took Margaret's life in a place she should have felt safe. Her base, her community. In 1973, he killed Leslie, a young professional woman with a bright future. In 1974, he strangled Janet, a coach's daughter, while she was hitchhiking home. Each time, he selected vulnerable but capable women. Each time, he inserted himself into spaces of trust, military-based campus scouts. Each time, he vanished, until science remembered what the law forgot. Both Leslie and Janet were strangled, one with a floral scarf, the other with her own clothing. Ligature strangulation is an act of intimate control. Slow, deliberate, personal. He didn't shoot. He didn't stab. He strangled, over and over. That's the hallmark of a serial killer. But back then, serial profiling wasn't what it is today. And John knew how to wait, how to blend, how to disappear between murders, until the day the evidence stopped aging. So why her? I don't even know who she is. If that's the first girl or the one up on the hill. By the end, John Arthur Getreu wasn't just a man. He was a ghost of justice long delayed. A relic of an era when silence could protect the predator. When he was finally locked away in Santa Clara County, Maine jail, it wasn't his body that weighed heavy on the state. It was the bodies he left behind. Leslie Perlov, Janet Taylor, Margaret Williams, and maybe others. But now, the man who had slipped through legal systems in Germany, California, and time itself was finally facing the one thing he could never escape: the weight of his own past. Even after the 2 life sentences were handed down, one for Janet, one for Leslie, there was no emotional outburst from John, no breakdown, no confession. He remained eerily still, almost as if he had accepted something years ago that no one else could see. But outside that courtroom, the reverberations were enormous. For Chuck Taylor's family, the loss of Janet, Stanford coach's daughter, vibrant and curious, was no longer a cold case headline. It was a trial, a verdict, and finally, a truth. For Leslie's loved ones, her life as a quiet law clerk with a mind for justice was no longer a forgotten file in the archives. but on biology itself, because blood remembers, skin remembers, hair stories, not the killer, not the horror, but the resurrection of the victims, piece by piece, through science and storytelling. The case of John Arthur Getreu has become a textbook for cold case investigators, forensic genealogists, and true crime journalists. It demonstrates the power of genealogy-driven DNA breakthroughs, public database matches, decoy arrests and soft interrogations, careful psychological pressure